Shalom everyone, and welcome back to the Pilgrim Youth channel. My name is Elizabeth Dionisio, and today we will continue with our series of Torah studies in the book of Shemot, specifically chapters 19 and 20. And the title for today's study is Receiving the Instruction So As Not to Die. Last week, we learned how the Eternal protected and fought for Israel against Amalek's attack in Rephidim. Excuse me. Moshe, standing on a hill with staff in his hand, lifted his hands up, which represented the power of the Eternal to be manifested in the battle. And every time it was so, then Israel would win. But on the contrary, when Moshe would lower his hands down, Amalek was winning. When Moshe's arms would get tired, he sat on a stone while Aaron and Ur held up his arms, and at the end of the battle, Yehoshua defeats Amalek. And Moshe, as a result, built an altar called Adonai is my banner, in commemoration of the victory that the Eternal had made for them. After their victory, Moshe's father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, hears what Elohim has done for the Israelites, both in Egypt and with the current winning the victory that they had. And he came to visit Moshe, and along with Jethro came Moshe's wife and his two children. Jethro observed how Moshe judges cases, resolved problems for the people of Israel from morning until evening, and suggests that he should continue representing the people before Elohim and instructing them in the ways of Adonai, but that he should also appoint trustworthy men to serve as judges over groups of Israelites in order for Moshe not to wear himself out. Only the important cases would come to Moshe to give him some relief. And Moshe consults the Eternal, and the Eternal approves. And therefore, Moshe follows Jethro's advice, appointing judges. Today we will continue to analyze how the Eternal will demonstrate his purpose for humanity through the people of Israel. How Elohim is establishing his kingdom through his instruction that began with the descendants of Abraham and continues to stay firm in all the inhabitants that come to the true faith on earth. This kingdom is not a physical one as many tend to think, but we begin to live in the kingdom when we obey the will of the Eternal and totally submit to his authority that is revealed in his instruction. After the nation of Israel was freed from Egypt, out of slavery, protected from their enemies as they made their way to Mount Sinai, or the desert of Sinai, they were now going to be summoned by the Eternal Elohim to formally commit their lives in consecration for his service, to be light and salt to the world. The Eternal was going to show his holiness, and with the very nature of his instruction reveals the problems that humanity have, the tendencies of sin that we often fall into, the diagnosis of our imperfection, our sin, and our state of impurity through his word. And he will also show the necessity that we have as human beings, that we need guidance, that we need his instruction and his light to follow towards a life of holiness and righteousness, because it doesn't come natural to us. In the following chapters, we will analyze the requirements and conditions to be able to be called his children, to be able to be called his nation and considered a kingdom of priests or ministers and a holy nation. This condition to Israel and all believers in our time is to receive his instruction, put it into practice, and by doing so, we may receive eternal life. The instruction of the Eternals is the way that he rescues us from the death of sin, which is, we already know, the eternal death. And he gives us a way to approach him, for we will see further along that we cannot come to the Eternal however we please. So with this short introduction, let us start with verse 1 all the way to 4. And it says, on the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moshe went up to Elohim, and the Eternal called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. For you yourself have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. We see here that after they had left Egypt, which we know was the 14th, between the 14th and the 15th of Aviv, which was Pesach time, about 2 months after, they were going to receive this instruction. They were going to receive a message from the Eternal. They were going to be summoned by the Eternal to come to his presence. And the Eternal called to Moshe with a message to give to the descendants of Jacob. Part of this message was that the Eternal was reiterating to the nation that he alone was the reason why they were now living in freedom, and how he showed his favor towards them by protecting them from all harm and guiding them until that very day. He calls upon them as a father calls upon a child. For example, when a father calls his son or his daughter, is to give him instructions for their own good. So we see the very same nature here, the relationship that we can see that the Eternal wants to have with his creation. Him as the Heavenly Father and the ultimate Father with his creation, he wants to come and be in front of them to instruct them. And we have already established in the previous videos that the nation of Israel, in fact, are placed in scriptures or are described in scriptures as being sons, being a child of the Eternal, one in which they were vulnerable in that time, they were without instruction, and now the Eternal as a father was going to guide them through his instruction, through his commandments, that he was going to make a nation, as we will see in the upcoming verses. What was the purpose of the Eternal to want to come close to them? And it says in verse 5 to 6, it says, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole world is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests or ministers and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So once he establishes, so we see first of all that he reiterates that he took them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and now the Eternal is telling them what he wants from them. First of all, he's establishing that the entire world and everything in his creation belongs to him. And then he doesn't stop there. He says here in these texts that only those who obey him fully and keep his covenants, which means to put it into practice, to keep something is to practice it, right? To perpetuate it. And he says that only if they obeyed, if Israel would obey the Eternal, then they would be considered a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And this really comes to, this really gives us insight of how the Eternal's character is truly. How is it in justice? Why? Because many people think that the Eternal called the nation of Israel regardless of their sin. For example, like regardless that just because they came from the seed of Abraham or they come from the lineage of Abraham, that they would be saved just because of that. But in fact, we see that the one distinction that the Eternal sees, or the distinction that Israel was going to have, was due to their obedience. And we see that although, yes, there's always a remnant within the nation of Israel, not everybody was able to go into the promised land. And the same thing goes here. We see here how the Eternal placed a condition. His covenant has a condition. And this condition the people of Israel had to adhere to receiving it, and they had something to do with. Like, for example, we can think about this condition as the marriage oath, right? Where a written document is done, as we will see here, that further along in the study, we will see how the Eternal gave these 10 phrases to the people of Israel as a document. Then there were witnesses that are present in the marriage oath, and so were the entire people of Israel. And there are conditions in the marriage as well. What are those conditions? That the spouses should show fidelity to one another, to show respect, to fully commit to work through the tough times, and that this pact, this oath that they're doing before the Eternal and before all of the witnesses that are that come to the wedding, then they're saying that nothing will set them apart, only death. So we see here that the Eternal wasn't just going to call whatever people and say, well, you are saved because you're saved, and you are condemned because you're condemned. We don't see that. We see that the only thing that distinguishes a person is obedience. And in fact, in Ezekiel 23, we see how the Eternal compares Israel's sin as adulterating, like an adulterous woman, which causes a break of the covenant. We also see that this teaches us that we must commit to the Eternal with the commitment that we make to the Eternal is something serious. It's not something that we should take lightly, and it's not something that we can mold or that we can shape our pilgrimage as we wish. We have to be very careful with the things that the Eternal has given us. And what is it that the Eternal has given us? That through Yeshua, we are able to be called children of the Almighty through obedience, that a promise that didn't entail specifically for us, for the people that come from the nations. Through Yeshua, we have now the opportunity to be part of this nation, that if we obey the Eternal, if we submit into his kingdom, that we already know is not something physical, but is more so in his authority, then we also become partakers and co-heirs, or we become part of the promise too. And one of the things that gives us a way, or that we can see if we have a true commitment, is our deeds. As in Revelations chapter 3, 15 to 19 says that if our deeds are neither cold nor hot, then we are considered by the Eternal as lukewarm believers. People who are not fully cemented in the two pillars, which is the Torah and having the faith of Yeshua. This state of living causes the Eternal to spit those out of his mouth, meaning that he rejects the person who's lukewarm out of his presence. Those who are not rooted in the faith strongly causes the person to become to practice infidelity to the Eternal, to have mistrust, and ultimately doubt the Eternal's power and ability to fulfill his promise. The Israelites had to fully understand that their distinction among the nation was conditional, and that's the only thing that distinguished Israel from all of the nations, and even in our day today as well. The only thing that distinguishes is a person in this life is it depends on our obedience to the Eternal. It is not a title that Israel just earned because of the lineage, because we know that even in Johannan's time, in the 1st century, Johanan the Immerser, which people call him John the Baptist, in John 3:9, he directed the same message to the religious leaders of Israel when they were coming to be submerged in the Jordan River without a true conviction, without sincerity. And he says, "Do not think you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you that out of these stones, Eternal can raise up children for Abraham." So we see this calling to be a holy nation was not going to be a simple one or an easy task to accomplish. This calling was a great one one that required the people of Israel and us today, who we say that we have Yeshua and the Torah, to have a responsibility, to have full commitment to doing and receiving this instruction that will help us to preserve our life. A life calling that would make them into the chosen people, a nation and a kingdom, who will not only say that they are the people, the chosen people, but more so that will demonstrate it in their life. Because Yeshua said in Matthew 7, verse 15 to 20, that we will know a person by their fruits. And Yohanan himself also said that true teshuvah, a true repentance to the eternal, we will see when we produce fruits of repentance. Fruits in our life, in our existence, that will testify that we truly do repent. We leave a life of sin and now walk towards the path of life, of everlasting life, to be able to receive salvation. This calling of a nation, the people of Israel that was going to receive this, they did not have to show in their attitude in being arrogant, as we see it in today's date, that there's a type of arrogance not only within the Jewish nation, that this elitist attitude that they feel better than other people regardless of their life, but more so we see that after Yeshua had given his sacrifice and given the correct interpretation of the scriptures, Shaul, which was an apostle, taught in Galatians 3:28 to 29 that now in Yeshua there is no Greek, there's no Jew, there's no slave nor free, there's no female or male, for all of us are one in Yeshua, our Mashiach. And if we belong, or if you belong to Mashiach, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. So we see here that it has nothing to do with us coming from Abraham's lineage physically, but it has to do, the distinction comes among all of the nations, around all of the creation, that we have obedience to the eternal, have faith in the eternal completely. And with this, we will continue with verse 7 to 13, and it says, so Moshe went back and summoned the elders that we saw that were placed last week, of the people, and set before them all the words that the Eternal had commanded him to speak. In verse 8, the people all responded together, we will do everything the Eternal has said. So Moshe brought their answer back to the Eternal, and the Eternal said to Moshe, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you, and you will always put their trust in you. Then Moshe told the Eternal what the Eternal had said, and the Eternal said to Moshe, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Make them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Eternal will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows, not a hand to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds, or the shofar, a long blast, may they approach the mountain. So all of the Israelites agreed to be faithful to the covenant. As we saw here, in one voice, they said, we will do whatever the Eternal said. That they would do everything that he instructed them. The Eternal was about to approach the camp in order to talk with the children of Yaakov. So he required, or he told Moshe that all of the people in the camp should have cleansed their garments. But before this, we do realize here that one of the purposes of the Eternal manifesting himself through this dense cloud was to make himself known, not only conceptually but also audibly, that it becomes something real for the people of Israel. Because unfortunately, as humans, we do not believe. It's hard to believe when we don't see, when we don't, like what the saying says, right? See to believe. But here they were going to see, they were going to witness the sovereignty of the Eternal in this creation, and they were going to hear his voice and how the interaction that the Eternal was having with Moshe, which not at the same time would verify or would confirm Moshe as a prophet, as a mediator between Israel and the Eternal, that he truly was an instrument of the Eternal that would pass along a message. Now, we see that this was the same thing that happened in the first century when Yeshua came, how the Father confirmed Yeshua as Mashiach in order for us now to believe that he is the true prophet, the prophet that was prophesied in Deuteronomy 18:18, that said was going to be even bigger than Moshe, that whoever didn't listen to his word was going to be cut out of the nation of Israel. So we see here this important aspect of Israel coming back to the aspect of cleansing, right? How the Eternal asked his people to get cleansed. And in Isaiah 1, verse 16 to 17 tells us exactly what does it mean to have our garments washed. Because now we know that in that time they did it in a literal form, but for us today, how is it that we wash our garments as much as they did as well? They had to do it in both sense. Is through our teshuvah, our life that becomes cleansed with, it says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. By doing the Eternal's justice, as we have already read, doing good and obeying him in every aspect of our life, our garments become clean, washing it in the waters of the Eternal, of the instruction of the Eternal. The purification that the Eternal wants the people of Israel to go through in that time, well, was the literal sense, and now us, we have to do it also in a literal, not in a literal sense where we wash our clothes, and I'm not saying with this that we don't have to wash our clothes, but in this time, we have to make sure that our spiritual garments are freed from all evil deeds. Cease for us to stop doing sin. And for all of us, an exhortation that I've learned in this passage was that if we have already received our garments white, right? When we come and do teshuvah in the presence of the Eternal cleanses us, right? But now it doesn't mean that he cleanses us forever, right? He cleanses us in that time when we come to him, we recognize that we need him. We recognize that we have been sinning all of our life, and now we need his redemption. We need his salvation. He will give us a new garments for us to wear in order for us to partake of the tree of life. But when he gives it to us and it's washed in the blood of the Lamb, now it's up to us to persevere and keep them clean. Because if not, then we revert back from our righteousness. And in Ezekiel 18:24, it tells us the following about that action. It says, "But when the righteous turns away from his righteousness and commits iniquity and does according to all the detestable acts that the wicked man does, will he live? None of his righteous deeds that he has done will be remembered, for his trespass that he trespassed, and for his sin that he has sinned, for then he will die." So we see here the very importance of this very important aspect of teshuvah, and for persevering in the covenant in a sanctified way, in a consecrated way. We have to work at it every single day. It's not one time saved for all, but it's more so we get this redemption. We get we get our garments washed by the blood of the Lamb, and now we have to keep them clean. We have to keep them white. And that's the way that we do it, is through our actions every day. Another thing that I would just like to highlight here is the number 3. As we see here that the Eternal said to get them ready in the 3rd day. The number 3 in scriptures alludes to the day of resurrection, specifically the resurrection of Mashiach, with all its purpose and power that calls us now to live in consecration and set apart for his service. Because it's essentially, just as the Eternal took Israel out of Egypt, was to serve him in obedience and spirit and in truth. And the same thing goes for us. When Yeshua gave his life and resurrected, then he is calling us to live a life of consecration and set apart for his service. We have a purpose now. In verse 14, in verse 14 to 15, it says, after Moshe has gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their garments. Then he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the 3rd day, abstain from sexual relations. So we see here another restriction. They were not allowed to have intimacy in this period of time that the Eternal was going to come close and give them instruction. They had nothing to be distracting. This was a personal, intimate time that every individual in Israel had to have a personal encounter with the Almighty. And, to refrain from things that would be distracting. From verse 16 all the way to 21, it says, on the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moshe led the people out of the camp to meet Elohim, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Eternal descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moshe spoke, and the voice of the Eternal answered him. The Eternal descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moshe to the top of the mountain. So Moshe went up, and the Eternal said to him, go down and warn the people so that they do not force their way through to see the Eternal, and may many of them perish. Even the priests or ministers who approach the Eternal must consecrate themselves, or the Eternal will break out against them. So we see here that through nature, a very good description of what was going on here, that through nature, the Eternal was demonstrating to Israel and the entire world just how his presence is just too much to be contained in our creation. He is clearly separated from his creation based in his nature and attributes. And one of his most, his most main one is his holiness, which is the foundation of all the other aspects of Elohim's character. In Revelations 4, verse 8, it describes how there were these 4 living creatures who sang to the Eternal day and night, saying, Holy, holy, Kadosh, Kadosh is the Eternal Elohim Almighty, who was and is to come. It is the Eternal's holiness that makes him like a consuming fire that will judge all sin, a fire that cannot be detained. And we merely see a little bit of a glimpse of how the Eternal sovereignty is truly like. Another important aspect that I would like to highlight here is how it says here in verse in verse 19, it says, the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. This trumpet in the Hebrew text is known as the shofar, which in other versions, in Tree Life version, it says, and the blast of an exceedingly loud shofar. This shofar was heard, and it brought with it great tremble in the inner core. Just as one day it will happen in the new future where the Son of Man will appear, Yeshua will return again, and it describes it similar to what was going on here. In Luke 21:27 says that the Son of Man was coming in a cloud with power and great majesty. When we see these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your head, because your redemption is near. So this is why this is very important, that when Yeshua returns, we must be prepared without a question, to be firm in our pilgrimage, because on that day, we will either be fearful and trembling for our lives for two reasons. Either we're fearful and trembling because we are not kadosh, we are not holy, we are not in the standard of the eternal and waiting eternal death, or we will be fearful and trembling because we're joyous that our redemption has arrived. This shofar that we see here was not only an audible one, like one that we can listen to, but it also awakened the soul, because it is a calling. This shofar sound or alarm is likened to how the Father calls us, or is calling. It's a wake-up call from our sleepiness in sin. For example, in Ephesians 5:14, it says, "This is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, raise from the dead, and Yeshua will shine on you." So we see this over and over, this exhortation. The commandment were given so we may acknowledge the eternal as one, as we see here that the eternal was manifesting his sovereignty over this mountain, and that and he shows us that we also have to be careful of how we approach him. We see here that the eternal is like, okay, well, let all of the Israelites come to me, we all come to our presence. We don't see that. We see that the eternal, on the contrary, right? We see how he puts limits of who and how far the people of Israel may approach the eternal. And in Ecclesiastes 5:1, it says, "Guard your steps when you go to the house of the eternal. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know what they are doing." So we see here that when we approach the eternal, when we say that we want to be cleansed by the eternal, that we want to be transformed in a life that is acceptable to the eternal, we have to be careful of moving forward of how we come in reverence to the eternal in our life. Are we coming in hypocrisy? Are we coming in debauchery? How is our life in our pilgrimage? And then, excuse me, from verse 23 to 25, it says, Moshe said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set apart as holy. The Eternal replied, "Go down and bring Aharon up with you, but the ministers and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Eternal, or he will break out against them." So the Moshe went down to the people and told them. So here at the end of the chapter, we see once again that the Eternal continues to exhort or continues to say, hey, people cannot come up here as they please. There is a limit to how the Eternal has given us to come to him. We see that the Eternal is an eternal of order, and that in order for us to come to him and live in his presence and withstand his presence, there are rules. There is an order that we have to adhere by and live by in order to withstand. And now we're going to see what is that instruction. We're going to see in the following chapter 20, we will analyze how and what commandments were given to the people of Israel to keep and obey as an act of showing their loyalty and submission to the covenant that they were making with the Eternal personally. As we already know, Abraham had made a covenant with the Eternal, but now the entire nation had to consciously make a decision to commit to this covenant as well. This was individual. We don't get saved in groups. We get saved individually with our conviction, because ultimately it's our every deed that the Eternal is looking at, is analyzing, and is examining. The Eternal was drawing near to establish and give his instruction to the children of Israel in an audible manner. And with this, let's begin. From verse 1 to 2, the Eternal continues to, it says, "And the Eternal spoke all these words, and I am your Eternal, your Elohim, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Traditionally, in Christianity, the following words are known as the 10 Commandments. However, in the Hebrew text or in Torah in general, the expression the 10 Commandments does not exist. This portion is known as Hasaret HaDiborot, or Hadiborot, which is the 10 sayings or the 10 phrases. The very first words of this phrase, the Eternal says, is not found in verse 3, as people say that he starts, and you shall have no other gods. In fact, it is the Eternal reiterates one more time that it was because of him that now Israel was out of their bondage. This calls the attention of Israel to recognize that they were in servitude once under the ruling of Pharaoh, but now they were freed because of the Eternal's favor and mercy, not because they deserved it, not because they were Abraham's lineage, or because they had something special. It was merely because of his mercy. These words or phrases expressed in this chapter is only a summary, or the phrases as we're calling it, not the 10 Commandments, right? They're phrases that the Eternal said, and they were only merely summarizing the entire instruction that we will see in further studies. In further studies. And these are in other studies. As we will continue to see more details, how the Eternal describes in more details or categories of the commandments. For example, we have commandments, we have decrees, we have statutes. All of these are different kinds, but nevertheless, they all are summarized in two things. As we will see sooner on, we see that the first 5 phrases that has to do with the relationship that we have with the Eternal directly. For example, our communion with the Eternal. What is the Eternal expecting us to do? How do we respect the Eternal? How do we show reverence towards the Eternal? And then the other 5 have to do with respecting and loving and the way that we treat our neighbors. And all of these phrases were what the people of Israel were hearing, this interaction that was going on between between Moshe and the Eternal. But it's interesting that Yeshua summarized it even further, even shorter than what was summarized here in this time, in Deuteronomy 20. In Matthew chapter 22, from verse 37 to 40, Yeshua summarized these commandments in 2. Love the Eternal with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second one is love your neighbor as yourself. All the law, verse 40 says, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. This by no means indicates that we should disregard everything else that the Torah said, because we know that Yeshua didn't come to abolish anything that was written, but he came to fulfill it. And therefore, Yeshua is not saying, well, we have to forget everything else. This is what we have to do now. No, it simply means that all of the commandments that we see in scripture are based on these 2 things. If we love the Eternal with all our hearts, our minds, and souls, and to respect and love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Then it continues to say in verse 3 to 6, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Eternal, your Elohim, am a jealous Elohim, punishing the children of their sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation to those who hate me, but showing love to the 1,000th generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Here we see how the Eternal absolutely, the first thing he says, no idolatry. Don't put anything before my service. Don't put anything in your life before doing my will. Consecrate your life. Consecrate the things that you have, the things that I have given you in your life for my service. For example, a job, right? A job is something that we all need to do. However, when a job or our work is interfering with our personal relationship with the Eternal, that very thing becomes an idol, becomes something that we put before the service of the Eternal, something that we put before the will of the Eternal in our lives. It doesn't necessarily mean only about having statues, having rosaries, having, I don't know, having having like bracelets or stuff like that can be idolatry. But it can be money, the love of money that drives us to put other things before the service of the eternal. Then in verse 7 it says, you shall not misuse the name of the eternal your Elohim, for your Elohim is not hold anyone guilty who misuses his name, or to take the eternal's name in vain. And typically how this is translated or is taught is that we can't say OMG, or we can't swear by the eternal's name. But more so in this context, in the Hebrew text, it alludes or it teaches us that taking the eternal's name in vain is when we disobey the eternal's commandments, and we show it in our conduct and living in rebellion. Why? Because if that's so, we're misrepresenting what we're saying that we are representing, right? So we're saying that we love the eternal, and we tell our relatives and we tell our friends that, wow, look, this is what I've learned in the Torah, this is what I've learned in the instruction. But then in our deeds, in our conduct, it's not consecration, there's no obedience, there's ego, there's all of these things that we already know that are not the fruits of the Spirit. Then we are contradicting what we're saying with our life, with our testimony. So that's why we misrepresent, or we stomp, or we profane the name of the eternal among the nations when we say that we love the eternal, but we do the complete opposite. So that is to uplift the name of the eternal, is to obey, to be consecrated, and to do what the eternal is asking us to do in our lives. From verse 8 to 11, it talks about the aspect of remembering the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And then it continues to say that 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the eternal your Elohim. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your sons or daughters, male or female servants, nor your animals, nor the foreigners residing in your town. For the eternal made 6 days in heaven and in earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the eternal blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So here we see once again the eternal established to all humanity, as we already saw in Genesis chapter 2, that all of humanity was given this instruction. It wasn't only for the Jewish nation. It wasn't only exclusively to the Israelites. It was for the entire world, that the eternal consecrated this day for us to stop what we're doing, and that we may come to his presence, that we may come to serve him, that we may come to rest. Now, Shabbat doesn't necessarily mean to rest, that you have to sleep all day, but it means that you have to stop doing what we do normally and consecrate that time to the eternal. Then it continues to say, 12, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land that the eternal Elohim is giving you. Here it calls upon for us as children to respect and give our parents the place in our life. And one of the reasons why this is very important to the eternal is because it teaches us something. It's not only about respecting our parents and just speaking to them well, but it's also how we care for them, how we take care, how we love them as our neighbors, how we demonstrate the love that the eternal has given us, and how we're going to demonstrate that justice to our parents as well. And the reason why this is important is because it figures, or it shows these figures of how the eternal is considered a father, and how Yeshua as a son submitted fully to his will. How the eternal established this family structure that helps us to understand the relationship and the level of respect and reverence that we need to have to the eternal when we practice it with our parents. So that's why it's very, very important that we as youth should not forget. And sometimes it can be, I'm not going to say hard, but what I can say is that it could be a tendency where we feel very comfortable with our parents, that we often mistreat them, that we often disrespect them with us not even knowing, or if we know that we have to stop. So we have to ask the Eternal to help us in that aspect, if we are continuing to do it, right? Because if we're learning this, we have to be conscious of what we're doing. We have to put as much effort as we can to be able to be conscious of our decisions every day. In verse 13, it says, "You shall not murder." Of course, here we see that it's associating, or it's usually associated with another person taking the life of another human being. But it doesn't necessarily say that killing something is bad. For example, the slaughtering of sheep and animals was approved by the Eternal when it had to do with Holocaust. It had to do with, sorry, not Holocaust, but like a sacrifice. That's what I meant, a sacrifice. Killing for food, that is allowed, but to take the life of another human is not correct. Although Yeshua said in Matthew 5:21-22 that if we talk bad or we're harsh with our neighbors, then it is likened to a murder. And then in verse 14 it says, "You shall not commit adultery." Here we see that the Eternal directly speaks of the sins of conduct and lewdness, breaking the pact of the spouses. Here, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is about adultery, about a married man or woman having partnership with another person, but it's more so to show the basis of sexual immorality and how the Eternal considers a person who practices these things, that we will see in further along studies, that a person who does these things are not permitted. It's something that we need to understand as youth about this aspect of adultery and how the Eternal truly hates it, and how it is a sin, not only in our interpersonal relationships with another human being, but even more so in the spiritual aspect as well. Then it says in the verse 15, "You shall not steal." It's not talking about anything, not taking anything that doesn't belong to us, either that's material, ideas, material ideas, adapting things that are not from the Eternal. Also can be dogmas that we adopt, theories that does not belong to the Eternal. All of those things we have to set apart. Then it says 16, "You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor." So again, we start seeing how the Eternal is showing us how we have to be with our neighbor, right? Not stealing, not taking another person's wife. Then here we see that it's against us using like rumors, gossip, any false fabrications that can hurt our neighbor. And as well in 17 it says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife." You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. In that time, that was the context of Israel, of what a person materialistically can, carnally, fleshliness can desire. But in our time, we see that it's even more subtle. We have to truly be careful in how we conduct our life, because nowadays we see that social media, especially for us who are more involved in the more technological times, right? We use social media, we use computers, we use all of this technology. And it can be a double-edged sword, right? Where these social platforms is basically based on coveting, right? Coveting a person's relationship goal, coveting a person's lifestyle, coveting a person's belongings. They're wanting the car that the other person has, materialistically, money, lifestyle. All of these things ultimately start to wear down our spiritual lens and start to taint it. with wanting what other people have, instead of measuring our life with Yeshua, who is our ultimate example. If we want to follow somebody, the only person we can follow is Yeshua's example, because through him is the only way that we can truly come back to the Father in the way that he wants us to come back. So this is why coveting is something very important, and it's still very, 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 all of these commandments, all of these phrases truly are the baseline of all the other commandments that we will see further along in studies, and how they're still so relevant in our time today. And then after they're done, after this was said, in verse 18, it says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance. So we see here how all of this power were very, very, very scary for them. And I don't blame them. I think if I was in their time, I would feel the same way. It's interesting because when we're still in the faith, when we're learning in our pilgrimage, we are going to have, when we compare our lives and we see how much we still have to do, how much, when we look at ourselves in the mirror in the scriptures, we see how much we still have to accomplish, that the calling, how wonderful the Eternal is and how truly holy he is. Then sometimes that same precision or that thought can become a stumbling block for us, because the Eternal wanted to speak with them not face to face, but wanted to speak to them directly. But they were so afraid that they asked Moshe in verse 19, it says, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not let the Eternal speak to us or we will die. We see here that they are starting to feel very uncomfortable with, they feel fear of losing their life, because it was such a great scenario that was going on that they really thought they were going to die. I mean, nowadays, when we hear lightning is really strong, I cannot imagine how it was in that time. And we have to get to the point where we understand the holiness and the level of holiness of the Eternal that will help us and motivate us to continue to strive to get to a level where he accepts us, where he will receive us as his children. But it shouldn't be an excuse for why we say, well, it's too hard, I'm never gonna get to that point, and you know what, instead of that, I'm just gonna give up. No, we have to be like what King David said once in Psalms 51, 7-10. It said to ask the Eternal to cleanse us, that we shall be clean, to wash us, and then that we shall be whiter as snow. And in verse 10, in that same verse, in that same chapter, he says, create in me a pure heart, O Eternal, and renew a steadfast spirit in me. These are words of King David, that he recognized that he was nothing. He came close to the Eternal, but he recognized too that the Eternal was the only one who can cleanse him and to bring him close and to be reconciled with the Eternal. So the same thing for us, it shouldn't be something that will not motivate us, but instead of that, will help us strive and work harder to be better daughters and sons of the Eternal. And then to finish, it says, Moshe said to the people, do not be afraid. The Eternal has come to test you, so that the fear of Elohim will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moshe approached the thick darkness where Elohim was. Then the Eternal said to Moshe, tell the Israelites, you have seen for yourself that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any idols to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gold. Make an altar of earth for me. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offering, your sheep and goats and cattle. Whatever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you come, make an altar of stones for me. Do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, and expose your intimacy. So once again, we see here more additional exhortations that the Eternal gives about idolatry. And it's interesting because the Eternal, it was almost like he was hinting that there was something going to happen with this very thing that he said it 2 times. And again, we saw that in scriptures, if there's 2 times that it says something, is because the Eternal is confirming it. He hates idolatry and it's an abomination for him. So it kind of like the Eternal is almost like giving hints of what was going to happen, but he was trying to prevent it, that the people understood that he does not want idolatry, that he wants to be the people of Israel's own, that he should be the only safeguard that they felt and they knew that they had in the world. And the same thing for us. He wants us to come to him, not having a plan B, a plan C, and that only him is the only way that we can come to his presence and receive his instruction in order for us to have life. Further along, we saw that the Eternal was also hinting or alluding to how the sacrifice was going to be held. How is it going to be done in this earth as a model of what it is in heaven? So we will see further along in the studies how this will be manifest, and how the Eternal is giving us a little bit of a sneak peek of what we will see in the upcoming text. And to conclude, it's very interesting, and it's an exhortation that I've learned in this portion, that the Eternal truly doesn't want anybody to perish, and he wants us to come to him and come to him authentically, not with hypocrisy, and to receive this instruction that will help us to see our sin, to see our condition, that we may recognize by seeing ourselves compared to the Word, and recognize that we truly need the Eternal and that we cannot live without him. And what a blessing it would be that from our youth we can understand and discern this, and that it can help us to be able to live a life not only for eternity, but even a correct life, how the Eternal wants us to live in this earth as well. And with this, I want to just end this video with what Shaul teaches in Hebrew 12:8-10, that Adonai disciplines those who he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his sons. But for what purpose? It says that in verse 8, so that you are not illegitimate, not true sons or daughters, whoever doesn't receive this discipline. But the purpose is that we may share in his holiness. The Eternal is not asking us to be big people in the world with big careers, with having all the things in this life, but he's calling us to holiness. And this is a calling that is very, very important, and it's something that we cannot accomplish overnight. So we thank you for your attention, and if the Eternal gives us more life, that we can see each other in another video, but may the Eternal help us to put all of these teachings into practice. Thank you very much for your attention, and shalom.